We are Bibo Keeley and Brian Keeley.
The Shared Heart is our ongoing art project, which we started in 2013 in response to our experience of my heart attack, critical illness, and survival, thanks to a heart transplant in that same year. It is informed by the two different perspectives of our shared journey.
In 2013, we were on a holiday on the island of Islay off the west coast of Scotland. We had a heat wave and went swimming with our two rescue poodles in the sea every day. We had been island hopping in our self-built camper van, visiting distilleries and making new friends. It was the ideal holiday and everything seemed perfect.
Then, in the morning of the 24th of July, the last day of our holiday, I started to have excruciating pains in my chest. I climbed into the back of the van and lay on the bed in agony, gasping for breath. It was terrifying, and I knew it was serious.
I jumped into the van and started driving to the ferry terminal nearby, hoping to find help, and they called an ambulance. Brian was taken to the small island hospital. The doctors were really lovely, but they didn't have the medical equipment they needed to help. So Brian was helicoptered to the mainland, while I had to catch a ferry and drive the long way to Glasgow. When I arrived late in the evening, he was in a coma. We were suddenly plunged into this world of critical care without any preparation. In the weeks and months that followed, every single day it was uncertain whether Brian would survive or die.
I knew nothing of my first weeks in intensive care, and I only gradually became aware of where I was when I emerged from a medically induced coma. I could feel a lot of tubes and wires tugging in my neck and my arms. My eyesight and my hearing was dulled. I couldn't move, and my chest felt heavy and lifeless. I had no idea that I had been like this for weeks.
Brian's heart attack had been so serious that he needed several emergency operations in the early stages. He went into cardiac arrest, had a stroke, and sustained multi-organ failure before being placed on a machine which took over the function of the heart outside his body. His kidneys were damaged and he needed dialysis. He also needed a ventilator to support his lungs via a tracheotomy in his throat, which meant that he couldn't speak or eat. He was being fed via a tube through his nose into his stomach, and the banks of machines also administered various medications and powerful painkillers.
I couldn't see any of these machines as they were all behind me out of my sight, but I was aware of the constant noises and the nurses monitoring them, so it was very frightening and I wanted to understand what was going on.
I realized that Brian was unable to see his surroundings from his perspective. In order to help him understand what everything looked like and how he was attached to all these machines, I took a few photos which I showed him on the laptop.
Over time, I came to understand that I was never going to get out of this situation without a heart transplant, but I was on a ventilator and also on kidney dialysis, and I knew that these were barriers to being placed on the transplant list. It was a catch-22 situation. I was so sick that I needed a transplant, but I was too sick to survive one.
Someone told me that there's nothing the doctors can do to help kidneys heal. However, in early September, Brian's kidneys began to start working again by themselves.
But I was still struggling to come off the ventilator because breathing was so painful. It felt like I just couldn't get enough air into my lungs. Eventually, they discovered fluid in my chest cavity, and I had a drain inserted and 2 litres of fluid came out. This reduced the pressure on my lungs and was an immediate huge relief.
Now that Brian's breathing began to improve, we dared to have some hope. However, despite the apparent progress, he was still in an extremely critical condition, and a few days later, palliative care was introduced. It was absolutely devastating. When the doctor and the nurses left the room, I turned to Brian and said, Don't believe a single word they say. You are not dying. You will survive.
I still couldn't speak, so I had no way to articulate my thoughts. But thankfully, Bibo said, "Let's get married and do it right away." I thought that was a great idea. We had been together for 15 years, and we both felt this was the right thing to do.
Everything was arranged in less than 24 hours because we were told that Brian's situation was so critical that we should not delay. Some very lovely people went out of their way to make it possible. Hospital staff, as well as a few of our friends and family.
I felt happy and sad at the same time because I didn't know if we would have a future. I had now been in intensive care for more than 2 months, but from the wedding day onwards, things did begin to improve. Within the following couple of weeks, I was finally able to come off the ventilator and breathe unaided. The tracheotomy came out, and I could finally speak again. The feeding tube also came out, so I could start to eat properly again and gain a little bit more strength. All of these factors meant that in the middle of October, I was eligible to be put on the urgent transplant list.
The day after Brian was put on the urgent transplant list, we were informed that there might be a suitable heart for him. That's all we had hoped for, but suddenly we were absolutely scared. We even said our goodbyes, just in case.
However, this time the transplant did not go ahead. I was then on the list for another 2 weeks. It was a very anxious time because any relapse or infection would mean being taken off the list. And you never know when, or more importantly, if a donor organ will become available in time. And because of the circumstances of organ donation, news of a potential transplant happens with very little notice. I was woken on the morning of the 2nd of November and told that I would be getting prepared for a transplant in only a few hours. After an initial flurry of medical preparation and meetings with the surgeon and others, Bibo and I were left alone to wait. The last thing I remember was being wheeled in my bed along the corridor towards the operating theatre, surrounded by medical staff and Bibo in the background.
During Brian's heart transplant, I waited alone in my hotel room, which had become my home for the last 101 days. I received regular updates by phone about the progress of the operation. In the early hours of the next day, I was allowed to briefly see Brian from afar when he was back on the intensive care ward. Brian and I had agreed that I would take photographs of his recovery if he survived. I wasn't ready for it this first time I saw him, but I started the following day when he was still unconscious. I found it very difficult to take the first few pictures, but it got easier as Brian improved. And so I created a comprehensive body of photographs documenting the immediate post-transplant recovery process while still in hospital. These photos have since been exhibited on a number of occasions.
When I came round the day after the operation finished, I was confused and shell-shocked, but I was still in intensive care and still attached to lots of lines and machines. So it took some time before I realised that I was actually alive and had survived the operation.
The success of the operation is only the very first step towards survival. The risks of rejection and other complications are extremely high in the first hours after the transplant, and that continues into days and then weeks. The whole first year is very precarious, and even thereafter, this threat never goes away, so there is never an end point when you can say, now it's over.
It took a lot of painful and hard work to get back on my feet and to face the challenges ahead. At the time, I never thought of the future because every minute of every day on the long road to recovery was so physically and emotionally intense. Having a transplant is just the beginning of a lifelong commitment to a strict medical regime, a heightened awareness of infection risks, which can have serious consequences, and regular monitoring through blood tests, scans, biopsies, and so on. However, Despite all of this and a number of ongoing health impairments, I am extremely grateful to be alive and that Bibo and I have the opportunity to explore our shared experiences together through what we do as artists.
I can't even begin to say how much we owe to organ donation and to all the medical professionals who help people like Brian to survive, and all those who make organ transplantation possible.